morning and welcome to the Audience and Media Intelligence Solutions Telma and BrandMapp webinar. I hope you're all doing well today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited. I hope you are as well. My name is Penelope, Client Success Associate of Telma, working across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Thank you very much again. This has been an amazing series of webinars, and this is the last one for this series. It's exciting. I'm excited, and I hope you're going to be happy to learn a lot today. I am not alone. I'm with the Director of Storytelling for Wi-Fi Insights. I promise you're in good hands because there's no one who knows the BrandMapp data like him. Our Yoda for today, Brandon DeCock.
Thank you.
BrandMapp has been providing insights for an exciting 10 years. Today, Brandon will look at decoding media trends, unveiling the winners behind today's media landscape, which will include or involve looking at a radical year for social media, radio's new normal, the impact of fiber in the home, whether there is anyone who is still watching TV, and what media people trust. This is an interactive session, so feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A as they come along. Brandon, over to you.
Thank you so much, Penelope. I hope you can all see me, and I hope I've got the right screen mode. I believe last week I was showing you the wrong screen, but today hopefully you've got full screen mode. Good morning and welcome everybody to part two. Those of you who were with us last week will know we unpacked some of the big mega trends that we see in the consumer landscape. Today is specifically about media. So I haven't put too much context and preamble up front. If you need the context on BrandMapp and exactly what we do, you'll have to watch last week's webinar. Today we're talking media, and I thought this is about the best way I can explain what's about to happen. We talked last week about how for the first time in 10 years, we saw the BrandMapp data set pretty flat. We don't think a lot happened. The stuff that did happen was super interesting because there were these big sort of spikes, big trees on the landscape. The media thing's slightly different, and I speak as an old media hound. I made a living out of words and pictures most of my life. And boy, it's been a roller coaster ride for those of us who've been in the game for decades. I mean, I know I don't look it, but I have been in it for decades. So it still continues to be a roller coaster ride. I think what's interesting about modern media and about globally where the media landscape sits, it's a place of some pretty radical, extreme, and sudden change. That probably accurately describes the world we live in. But media is kind of definitely one of the places where when we do see change, it can be quite radical. And I'm going to talk you through a couple of those points today. So a lot of what I've done today is I've trended the data for the last 3 years. It's a lot of what I'll be showing you because it's just the best way to understand where and how these spikes that we see come from. Okay, so let's go for a little bit of a ride. I do need to start off with the normal context. It's a bit of a bugbear for me. I don't like it when people say X number of South Africans or X number of adults without giving you context. So before anybody jumps in late, and if somebody does jump in late and say that doesn't sound true, please on the chat room be sure to point out to them that they missed the beginning and they missed the context. So here's the context. We right now are a country of 43 million adults, and we earn 3.5 trillion rand a year. We know those facts to be reasonably true from the latest census and from the Treasury Department. When you split that money up in the households of South Africa, we discover about 70% of adults live in households earning under 10,000 rand a month. Sitting inside there are all of our social grants. 50-something% of those people don't have bank accounts. 25% of those people never have enough food to feed the whole family. It's a group of people that relies quite heavily on the two pieces of the triangle above them. The middle piece of the pie is the 10 million roughly adults who live in households earning between 10 and 40,000. That's another 25% of the population. And right at the top, this little group of adults who live in households earning more than 40,000 rand a month. When you split the 3.5 trillion up, you see the numbers on the right. That top little 5% of the triangle, those top 3 million adults are taking home more than half of all household income. So we've always said that what we do in BrandMapp and what we've done for the last 10 years is to try and understand the top piece of this pyramid. The bottom are very important, but if the top of this pyramid ain't healthy, resilient, doing super well, everybody else is going to be in a bit of trouble, because not only do they take home 85% of all formal income, but they pay 100% of personal tax. Okay, so the people at the bottom rely on the people in the top to make the money, to pay the taxes, to create the money that trickles down into the informal sector. Okay, so everything that I'm about to show you, if you ever quote these figures, please remember to say, we are only talking about the 13 million adults who live in households earning more than 10,000 Rand a month. Okay, that's the boring preamble piece, much shorter than last time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about big media landscape for a moment, just at the bottom. We're living in this media world where there's no doubt that the impact of digital, the impact of connectivity is clearly what's influencing these sort of pretty radical shifts we see. And I just thought I'd point something out. Like, at the same time, those of you who were online last week will know we have a slightly different story about that top piece of the triangle and the way it's growing. The number of newcomers into the high income segment, that 30,000 plus personal group, is growing at 12.5% a year. It's double inflation. So there are some good stories to be told. And here's a good story just to set the scene for you. If you don't know about Connect SA, just go and read up on it. It was a government project passed way back 2016. It was sanctioned. And it had some pretty high ambitions of getting South Africa connected. And when I say South Africa, I mean that whole triangle, the people at the bottom. And I do go and watch this every year. One of my messages for you today with this media pack is I think we should be using as much data as we can. Don't be lazy with data. Go and see what happens in your data and go and find something else in another set. Add things together to try and tell the whole story. So at the bottom of the triangle, here's what's happening with connectivity. This is according to Letitia Masia. So she's at the bottom, you'll see the Deputy Director of Government Communication Information System, which I think abbreviates to the GDGCIS or something like that. Anyway, she's the spokesman for what's going on with SA Connect. Households without internet access in the last 10 years have gone down from 65% to 21%. Yeah, so even in the total triangle, even in the bottom of the triangle, there are things happening relatively quickly. SA Connect, the project, came to the end of its first phase last year, and they had, as I say, an optimistic view of what was going to be happening. This is what they managed to achieve as of October 2023. They've got 970 schools and healthcare facilities connected, about 5,500 households, and 188 community hotspots. That's as of October 2023. It's not a bad result. I mean, it's obviously, it leaves a huge amount of work to be done. And phase 2 has already started. The idea of phase 2 is that at the end of 2026, they're looking at 50,000 community households, community hotspots in schools, and they want to get 5.5 million households connected. Already, they've got 1 million, million connected households through Connect SA. I think it's a really interesting picture of, we obsess about with digital sort of at the top of the triangle, and we also worry about people with access to data at the bottom. But this is a really interesting project to watch. Google it, check out the facts and figures. They're constantly releasing what's happening. The most interesting thing about it is that the cost of that data is now down to about 5 Rand a gigabyte. And for 250 Rand a month, a household can get connected uncapped or unlimited. So don't think that just because I'm about to show you some pretty radical stories about growth, that growth isn't happening throughout the whole of that triangle. I think it's super important. What's happening in the BrandMapp audience? So we still see South Africans being increasingly connected all of the time. Okay. For those of you who don't like bar charts, you're going to have a tough hour. These are, for me, bar charts are the simplest infographic ever created, especially when you're trying to show trended data. So I haven't gone a long way outside bar charts, guys. It's for me, this tells the story. I always look for these slopes, what I call them ski slopes in the data. The moment you see ski slopes, you've got an interesting story to tell. We've asked this question for many years. You can see the impact. So 2021 is always effectively the impact of COVID. That's what happened. We know that there were vans driving around during COVID, putting those little gray boxes on as many walls that they could find all over the suburbs. And this was the result. But it's continued apace, right? I mean, the idea that 45% of that whole top of the triangle is now connected by fiber, it's a complete game changer, right? I mean, it means that everybody's connected the whole time in the household on their own devices, doing their own thing. And obviously, we've seen some pretty amazing sort of physical manifestations of this. One of them is now this. So this is taking a look at the impact of smart TV. So smart TV ownership in the home going through the income bands. The way to explain it simply is that we have 33% is now our measurement of all households in the BrandMapp audience having a smart TV at home. This is the variance. This is the delta between the beginning of the taxpayer class, people living in households earning 10 to 15, 20% of them have got a smart TV, all the way up to 42% of the wealthiest households in South Africa. These are the kind of things that result from something as simple as fiber. So again, what I love is looking in the data, seeing a chart like we saw before, and then going, wonder what the possible impacts could be. Because if you have this rapid increase in the technology or in the access, the actual platform, imagine how that's going to translate into behavior. The other obvious place we see it is streaming, right? So this is what happened in that COVID year. If you look at something like Netflix, back in 2020, we measured Netflix at 41%. So the year before, Netflix also did very well. I think it was about 30 odd pre-COVID, or 26, 27. So it had a big leap there anyway. But man, COVID was a proper booster shot for Netflix. It just rocketed it. South Africa was just like everywhere else in the world, of course. You know, the Netflix story during COVID is a global story. We then saw it kind of still increasing a little bit as the year went on, and we were wondering what was going to happen this year. You'll notice we've got, you know, these other channels which coming off a very small base, these other options. YouTube Premium we've never measured before, and Disney Plus for the first time measured in the current data set that we've just released. So what does it look like for this year? Well, super interesting, because it's the first time we've seen a tail off in Netflix, but I think it's clearly got something to do with the battlefield getting a bit crowded. You know, you now have more choices. You have a choice of Disney Plus. You have a choice of Prime Video. If YouTube is important to you and you want to spend that money on YouTube Premium, maybe that's where you'll go. And I see this. This is probably going to, I think this is an ever-changing battlefield. I think it's going to change quite rapidly. I wouldn't be surprised if some of these players come up with really interesting strategies to kind of double their markets in a year, kind of thing. As far as the rest of the streaming services go, we also obviously measure the audio services. And the best way to kind of tell that story is with this chart. So here I've taken the generations. So Gen Z are basically the under 25s. Millennials go up to 37 odd. Gen X is the under 55s, called it. Boomers, silent. Okay, so this is a generational view, and I've just added in the audio services. The story is quite clear. The younger audiences far more likely to be on Spotify and Apple Music. They're still on Netflix. They're still using and subscribing to Netflix, but far, far more likely to be on Spotify and Apple Music. And then Showmax and Disney and Netflix are actually showing what I'd call that sort of familiar curve. You know, these are clearly households that are watching for entertainment purposes. The childbearing households of South Africa are more likely, it looks like. The story here is sort of quite simple to me, though, because if you connect this back to the original idea of fiber in the home, just start getting a picture of what's happening in those homes. You know, you've got 3.6 people on average in a South African home. Those people are listening to their own devices, and they're streaming their own stuff the whole time. And the youngsters are probably a little bit more likely to be listening to music while mum and dad are watching Netflix, you know, on their handheld device in the bed. So yeah, our behavior is slightly different with age cohorts. The net overall result is still that, you know, Netflix is a major player still in the game. And then we also see it in an area like this. So we've been measuring podcasts for 5-6 years now. We ask a simple metric. We obviously can't ask what podcasts you listen to. We'd have to, that would take us a year to fill in the options. So podcasts are really interesting because what I would say to you is that they're moving in the right direction, albeit slowly. but this is probably the best way to just get an overall measure on it. We actually measure it differently. We measure frequency once a week or more, or every day or a few times a week, and never is hardly ever never. Sorry, never's never. So you'll see that never, super interestingly, has gone down quite rapidly, right? I mean, 38 to 30%, and that's post-COVID. So this is after the COVID effect. The way to maybe state this is that we are now in a consumer landscape where, given all of this stuff, given connectivity, given everything that we've just talked about, 70% of adults in that top piece of the triangle are now listening to podcasts. It's fairly meaningful, and again, I think something that's only going to increase. I'd also just at this point say that, for those of us who are interested in this world of trying to measure consumer behavior, this place is getting hard. Hey? It's like, I think the listening to a podcast through Spotify and listening to it through YouTube, where you've got cameras in the studio, is like, whoa, man, we're gonna get very quickly. We're gonna get to a place where these things are very, very hard to measure because there's just too much noise in the system. Anyway, right now, let's take it for granted that these people understand what a podcast is, that it's something that you download onto an audio device, your phone normally, and you listen to while you're cooking or going for a run, or driving home in the car. And it looks like there's a gentle upward curve here. It'd be interesting to see what this chart looks like over the next 3 or 4 years. So that's the digital sort of landscapey stuff. There's clearly growth. We can all see that. The big question, obviously, is what is the impact on old or traditional media? And I think this is where the story gets kind of interesting, because remember that triangle. Remember that there are a lot of people in South Africa who don't have access to these kind of high end or high ticket price items. And even within the top of that triangle, there are learned behaviors, there's legacy, and there's facility. It is quite easy and nice to watch TV sometimes rather than watching stuff on your cell phone. So, question, is there anybody out there when it comes to old media, and where does old media sit right now, traditional media? Well, here's the first stab for you. The answer to is there anybody out there is definitely yes. Simple question. How often do you watch TV? And this is what we get out of the total BrandMapp audience for the current data set, the 2023 data set. So that's super interesting, because it means that 75% of adults do watch television still every single day. This is one of those beautiful, you might have heard of the 80-20 rule in world, that 80% of your profits come from 20% of your customers. In the BrandMapp data set, what we see so often is a 70-25% rule. If we look at large behaviors, so if we look at stuff like, do you exercise? Do you actually do any exercise? Do you play any sports? It's a 75-25% game. 25% of people are couch potatoes, 75% get exercise. And television very much sort of falls into that scope. Effectively, it's a 75-25 game. It just means that TV is still a super, super powerful mechanism. And obviously, when you break this down by age groups, which I haven't done, but you could do that in the data. Those of you who are BrandMapp users or data users on Telmar, just run this by age groups. You'll start to see that although younger people are less likely to watch TV more frequently, the overall number is still very similar, sort of throughout almost any segments or any filters that you put on this data. What are they watching? Well, interestingly, 70% of the BrandMapp audience are still watching DSTV. So, DSTV, we know, over the last couple of years have had some challenges keeping those premium subscribers. The super wealthy are still probably out of habit more than anything subscribing to premium services. And there's obviously been a big shift at DSTV between the packages that their subscribers have moved onto. But the gross fact is that DSTV remains in middle market and up South Africa, in the tax-paying South African audience, an incredibly powerful channel. 70% of these people are still watching TV. What happens when we ask specific channels? So we've done this for the last couple of years. We've gone back to asking, what channels you watch. This is an edited view. We've got about another 15 or 12 odd channels that we measure. But I just thought I'd pull out the actual footprint of what I'd call the old free-to-air channels. This is pretty significant, eh? The fact that ENCA has this massive footprint in the audience speaks volumes for it as a news channel. And still quite high volumes or quite high sort of eyeball volumes, in my humble opinion. I think there was a thought a few years ago that SABC had stopped catering for people in the top piece of the triangle. Nah, there's a lot of eyeballs still on the old SABC channels. That's why there's a huge responsibility on them to do the right thing and keep going. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting picture, and most importantly, we've just so now I'm throwing add another little database on. We did a huge piece of work this year together with Silverstone and Moya app. Just a piece of research on voter sentiment, and one of the things we asked people is where they're going to get the information that's going to inform their voting. Throughout the income bands, you'd be amazed how these television and news channels are incredibly powerful still in the people's minds about what influences something as important as voting. So yeah, definitely there's a lot of TV still going on, a lot of TV watching still going on. What about radio? Well, radio is a fascinating story for us. We work in radio a lot. We've got a lot of radio clients. They kind of like the BrandMapp view of the world because we're able to get a fairly large sample of top end consumers or higher income consumers, which allows radio stations that don't seem to gather large samples in something like the BRC data, who do an amazing job. But in terms of profiling people, sometimes with the higher end stations, they don't quite get enough to profile those listeners in the right way. So we do a lot of work in that area, helping sort of smaller, more middle class and up stations profile their audiences. The radio story that we've tracked, so this is super simple, right? Just how often do you listen to the radio? Look at the story here. Look at what the impact of COVID was. So we were obviously quite worried at that stage, looking at that drop and going, phew, that lockdown thing, man, it made a big difference. But actually, radio is completely recovered in our view. These shapes are not massively significant. You've got a little bit of a shift in over the years, and as time goes on, I would expect that to just keep wobbling along on a sort of a strange trend graph. I think it speaks volumes. It definitely feels to me like radio has reached its new normal. And there's a second piece of evidence about radio and the new normal, which sits in here. So we asked this question back in 2019. When do you listen to radio? We didn't ask it in 2020, and we popped it back. We weren't sure that it was that interesting, so we popped it back in 2021 after COVID to see what had happened. So this is a missing a year shift, okay? But I can tell you that there's no way that the data for 2020 wouldn't have been incredibly similar to what you see here for 2019. It was static for years up until COVID. The radio listenership, and remember, again, this is mid-market and up, right? These are people who were driving to work and back, and mostly in their own car. The afternoon drive time was as strong. In fact, it was slightly stronger always than the morning drive. And that's really the main area where we saw a shift in listenership behavior. So what COVID did was it sort of made morning listenership apparently a little bit stronger, and it made everything after being at work lose a little bit of traction. We never measured driving around during the day back in 2019. It didn't seem important to us. So when we measured it after COVID, it was interesting, or after lockdown. We thought it was fascinating that it was the second after morning. It was the next biggest listenership opportunity is driving around during the day. It made complete sense knowing what people's shifting hybrid work habits were like, right? So we know that half of the taxpayers haven't gone back to working at the office. They're working the hybrid model. They're driving around during the day, more likely to be driving around during the day than driving home at rush hour. So what's happened to this in the years that followed? Well, if we eliminate 2019 and just put a little black mark over that and go, how has this pattern changed over the last 3 cycles? How's that for a flat landscape? It looks to me like those habits have stuck completely. I can't see why there's no reason for them not to stick. We measure that hybrid work behavior. We measure the consumer mobility as being very, very similar over 3 years. So for me, the story is incredibly simple. It's that radio remains an incredibly powerful mechanism in South African in the media landscape. Certainly, if you want to reach this end of the market, if you're looking at that top 30%, it's incredibly important. Um, and those habits have changed and they've stuck, and we really do have a new normal when it comes to radio. What about the old dinosaurs? Well, let's talk about newspapers quickly. I said print media, old habits die hard. Well, the habit on the left-hand side is kind of interesting. So again, we measure still buy newspapers as more, same, less. So I've simply added those together to get a still buy newspapers metric. You'll see the effect of there was a big shift in 2020. COVID again sort of had this effect. So that the two sides of this chart are the things that I find fascinating, that you have an increasing propensity to not read newspapers at all. And that explains, I suppose, the pain in the industry, right? These guys they're still in a real battle. But the right-hand side I find equally interesting, that it feels like there's this group of 34% of people who they're still buying newspapers, and they're going to continue to pay for those newspapers. So in a way, old habits die hard. What about magazines and glossies? Well, their picture's slightly different, right? So if you look at that 4-year trend, it's been a little bit more extreme for mags. The flattened curve on the right-hand side of still buying is very different. It's still going down. So for me, the magazines are still it feels like the newspapers have come out the loop-to-loop on the roller coaster, and they're going, some of them, whoever's left in the car on the roller coaster, they're still going. Magazines they're still on that loop to loop, it feels. I do think it's interesting the way you'll see the number of titles that are available when you walk out of when you walk through the aisles at the shopping centers. It's amazing how that number's come down. We predicted that would happen in the old days when my partner Stuart and I were working at what used to be called Ramsey Media. We were trying to predict what would happen in the future, and we thought that there would be a group of magazines that resembled what the news shelves looked like sort of 25 or 30 years ago. A much smaller group of magazines that satisfy more niche needs. It seems to me that that's happening. So let me show you just a way, though, of interpreting data or telling the story out the data, because these two charts don't look great in terms of like where things are going and the trends. But here's the simple stat that we can take out of this, that right now, if there is a glass half full view of print media, it's quite amazing that 60% of adults still read newspapers and magazines. I think it speaks volumes for the kind of legacy of the industry. It's still around. They may not buy them, but they're very willing and would like to read them. So you just got to find a way of getting magazines and newspapers into people's hands, and they'll still read them. I also want to just add a lens to this, which is, we always measure community newspapers. It's also in the BrandMapp data, and you'll see that the propensity for those free titles, let's call them the free sheets, the community news, is incredibly high. People really enjoy community news. And one of the things that we must understand about print media is that, for a lot of people, it's some of their only access to media, right? If you, especially way down at the bottom of the triangle, print media may be the only thing that you can afford or get on a regular basis that keeps you informed. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how bad, my feeling is there will be a bottom out for both of these for print. We may only be left with a handful of print titles that still operate with any kind of sustainable business model in the country. But yeah, don't write it off completely. So that's and of course it's an excellent way of reaching old people. So let's talk about reaching young people. The youth market in South Africa, we have a median age of 27, right? So and in the mid market and up, that median age is it's 39. So there are as many people under the age of 39 who sit in the top two pieces of that triangle as there are over 39. How do you reach the younger market? Well, one of the places you can go looking is out of home. We measure out of home. We've had a lot of fun with it in the last 3 years. We've This year we've changed it up a little bit. We're trying to ask sort of more specified types of out-of-home media. What's important here, so again, I've got the generational view on the data. The question is important. The question we ask is, in the last few weeks, which of these outdoor media have carried an advert that caught your eye? So it's an efficacy measure as opposed to a gross awareness issue, right? If we said to people, have you seen a billboard in the last week? Everybody would probably tick yes, right? This is a different question. Have you seen something that actually caught your eye? And the number is really interesting on the right-hand side, because typically when you ask people in surveys about advertising and about what their awareness is, and if you ask wealthy people, especially, like, what do you think about logos on t-shirts, they'll all go, I hate logos on t-shirts. This question, I thought we would get a really bad result out of, actually. I thought a lot more people would say, nah, outdoor media doesn't affect me. But look at the actual number, right? So what the statement you could make here is that if you look at those millennials and Gen Zs, 72% of those young consumers are ticking a box to say that some form of outdoor media has actually caught their eye in the last few weeks. For me, that just means the efficacy of outdoor media is really, really high in general, that people are looking at these adverts, they are remembering them. But look at the sharp curve as you get older. And on the left-hand side, it's not as extreme, but some definite indication that the younger people, the younger the market is, the more likely outdoor media is to be having an effect on them. Okay. It's a very broad statement. There's lots of other stuff that you can go digging into if you're interested in outdoor media and you want to sort of start segmenting audiences, who's looking at which different types of billboards, etc. You can do that so easily in the data. It's quite good fun. But I suppose the real story about youth market and these days the market is probably sitting in social media, right? So I gave you a sniff last week of a social media chart and a social media trend. I'm going to tell the story slightly differently. So it's my only real story for you today. Bear with me. I happen to think it's quite a funny story, and it involves this thing. If we were all sitting in an auditorium right now, I would try and embarrass you by going, hands up if you've bought a Stanley Cup in the last year. But let me tell you the story about a Stanley Cup. So I was sitting calmly at my desk one day, and I got a call from a radio station in Cape Town saying, would you please come on and chat to the morning show host about the Stanley Cup craze, because we believe you're an expert in the Stanley brand, which was hilarious because it actually stemmed from an article that my wife and I had written in, I think, 2014 for Getaway magazine, where we were talking about Stanley flasks, and somehow they'd found me online. So I said, well, actually, no, I don't, but I've got a different view of the story if you're interested in it. So here's my view of the Stanley Cup story. If you don't know, the Stanley Cup thing was just this massive internet meme, and the sales globally have rocketed, and it was a huge story. And I went and started trying to unpack the actual timeline of what happened with Stanley Cups. But so also, if you don't know, Stanley flasks, the actual flask is typically that green flask that, and it works incredibly well. It's a 100-year-old product. The Stanley Flask Company has been around for ages, making these high-profile flasks. This thing arrived a couple of years ago, and effectively, it doesn't even have the top is got a straw coming out the top. It's kind of for people on the move, right? So it hit the gym market in a big way. But this is the full story of the Stanley Cup. This thing only really arrived in like 2017, 2018. It was floundering around as a product in the Stanley range. They really weren't selling very many of them. And in 2019, an American site called the Buy Guide picked up on the Stanley Cup, right? They loved it. They thought it was an absolutely amazing device. It kept cold drinks cold and it kept warm drinks warm, and it worked really well. And it's massive. Hey guys, this thing is like, it's huge. You'd struggle to get it into a small car. It's a huge thing, but so it stands out a country mile. The Buy Guide absolutely loved it. In 2019, towards the end of 2019, this Instagram influencer called Emily Maynard also picked up on it. She loved it, and she started promoting it through her channels. I always liked her byline there. Wife to hot guy from church. So one way of getting followers. So it started a little bit of social media here, and they started to see a few results. And then in 2020, this complete nutter took over as the CEO of Stanley. He came out of the Crocs world. So this man, Terence Riley, is almost individually responsible for the success of one of the ugliest shoes ever made, turning into a global sort of iconic brand. Very, very clever man, clearly knows what he's doing and clearly knows how to play the field. And Terence Riley came along in 2020 and realized that there was something going on with this particular mug, that it seemed to have real traction with influencers and in that world. And he started really, really pushing hard for collaborative relationships with people like Starbucks. He made them in various colors. There were pink ones and blue ones and green ones, and he really started pushing it. And the next thing that happened is that in 2023, towards this quite recent, right, towards the end of last year, a woman posted a video that went completely viral on TikTok. And it was about her car was burning, and then she goes into a car and she pulls this mug out, and there's still ice in it. And it's of course it's the Stanley Cup. Now, there have been a lot of conspiracy theories about whether or not this is true, because the straw seemed to be in remarkably good shape for something that came out of a burning car. But anyway, it went absolutely viral. And it was this that actually started not just the global rollout of the Stanley Cup, but because South Africa is simply part of the world, it was another one of those internet memes that just blew up, right? And it blew up because of TikTok. It's 100% attributed to it. What is the net result of that? Well, if you look at what happened to Stanley as a company in America, that is what their profitability, their annual revenue, sorry, not their profitability, that's what the revenue chart looks like. From 73 million in 2019 to 750, completely just blew the lid off. What happened in South Africa? Well, we caught sort of the end of this. Well, we caught onto it quite quickly. And in South Africa, the company that has the rights to Stanley Tools is known as Awesome Tools. I got a hold of Liz Woodruff. We've done some work with her before. And I said, what happened here? She said that the Stanley brand has doubled their business. They pre-sold a pallet of 12,500 cups well before it ever arrived in South Africa. Okay. Why am I showing you this story? I mean, apart from the fact that it's just interesting and it's quite fun, and that's the kind of the actual timeline in history. The thing that's interesting is that this success is 100% attributed to TikTok as a platform. It's TikTok that was the real firelighter under this whole thing happening. And I think it's a really excellent example of what can happen if you understand how fast changes are happening in something like the social media world. So let me show you what's happened in South Africa. Why would that be happening in South Africa? Why would we be catching on to some sort of global trend from TikTok? In 2021, this is what social media platform usage looked like. This is gross platform usage. So it's just which of these things do you use? And in 2021, that's what the landscape looked like. The following year, there wasn't much shift. TikTok came along, had a little bit of a bump up. But apart from that, there wasn't anything going on. But then we actually looked at TikTok and went, hey, hang on a moment. That is actually quite interesting, because 18 to 28 is a big footprint move. So what happened in the last year that could explain why we would also jump on the global TikTok bandwagon? That's what happened. So in that total BrandMapp audience, TikTok is the only one that has grown out of all proportion. There's things like a teenager on steroids, right? Or 28% to 40%, absolutely insane growth. This is obviously total growth, right? So, or total trend. And my theory has always been that that different people are using these different social platforms for different reasons. What happens when we apply an age filter to this total usership, right? So if you apply our generational thing, you'll see that actually the highest users of Facebook are now the boomers, right? So my theory for a while has been that younger people are still on Facebook to see what their parents are up to. That's just a theory. But look at the total difference here in these other platforms. Look at how the age shift for everything else kind of fits the picture that you'd imagine. Instagram, far more popular with younger people, far less popular as you go through the age spectrum. Twitter always had that millennial kind of hardcore. We think that I see that shifting. I think that Twitter's lost quite a lot of ground to TikTok, and you can see it there in Gen X. So that stronghold of Twitter, they're losing it. What's interesting about this is that it doesn't tell the full story. In BrandMapp, we do have one other measure that is super interesting. That you can use to go and try and understand how social media works in different cohorts or different groups. And it's the preferred social media metric. So what you're using then gives you a whole lot of options. And then we say, of all of these, if you could only keep one, which one would it be? What is your preferred social media channel? So it's a good way of deduping some of the stuff. And this is what it looks like. And all of a sudden you see how much more important the new channels are for these younger consumers. Yeah. So younger generations for me are far less tied to traditional social media. I think Facebook is fast getting into a place where we might need to start measuring it like we do newspapers and magazines. I think it'll always, not always be there. It'll be there for a very long time, but its relative level of importance for younger people is definitely going to diminish over time. And this is the chart that proves it. Look how important, though, TikTok. So TikTok on level pegging with Instagram in terms of its total footprint of being the most important medium. Super interesting, I think. The social story, it's it is what it is. And I think what's sort of important to remember is what I said at the beginning. Hectically fast pace of change is so possible in this world. Look at that 28 to 40% spike in a year for TikTok. And importantly, if you can make use of these things at the right time, look what kind of things you can make happen. Look at how many Stanley Cups you could sell. If you just understand these movements and these trends. So the last piece of the puzzle for you today is let's talk about how all of this has affected a fairly major aspect of media, and it's what we call the trust mechanism. I had a fascinating discussion with one of our friends in media, Louisa Codavilla, last week, and Louisa was saying that she had picked this up using the BrandMapp data, and we had a really spirited conversation about it and what the implications were. So I've gone in and I've had a pretty good look at trust. So we've asked this question. It's about news media, right? So, but I think the moment you put the word trust in and you associate it with different media, people will associate the two things. We can extrapolate this and say it's not just about news; it's about what do you trust. The old dinosaurs of newspapers, radio, and television, fascinatingly, still come out, or television and radio at any rate, even with a Gen Z filter on, still come out as the most trusted forms of media. Okay, super interesting. I did a bunch of qualitative focus group work last year towards the end of the year with some young people, trying to understand what the kind of path to validation was. And the story that I can tell you, we need to go back in a quantitative environment and measure this. But it seems that even young people are getting their news on social streams, but they're validating it through as many of the old channels as they can. So it's almost like I hear it first here, I get the headline, but then I need to validate it somewhere else. And a lot of the time they're going to turn to the old traditional media to try and validate that information. Nevertheless, this is what the totals look like for levels of trust in newspapers, radio, and television. We know that that COVID and the Donald Trump moment had an overall effect on media, right? There was a lack of trust in media that we saw after COVID. And none of these guys were immune. Radio, probably the least. Television, we saw taking quite a big sort of dive, and it's definitely on a downward trend there. And newspapers took a big hit in this last year. I'm not sure that many of us trust the newspapers in general of South Africa anymore. There are some challenges. But this is what it looked like for the old dinosaurs. What do you think happened, though, to digital media over the last couple of years? So remember, first of all, we can say that these three traditional media, when you associate the word trust, still maintain their place as the most trusted media, with one little exception, which we'll get to. So let's talk about guerrilla journalism. The conversation that Louisa and I had, she was talking about citizen journalism and how she thought that the reason for the lack of trust in old media is actually because people are not increasingly trusting citizen journalism. It's a fascinating debate to have around the boardroom table, or certainly around the Sunday lunch table. But let's just talk about it in old terms. Citizen journalism, guerrilla journalism, the idea of everybody from individuals like a Joe Rogan having their own media platform, through to commentators on platforms like Substack or just blogs or even WhatsApp. People who are leaders in communities or leaders in any kind of business structure, them being the spokespeople. That's what we mean by guerrilla journalism. Generally speaking, those people will be using digital channels to tell their stories. So let's go back to what happened to digital media thanks to COVID. Those in gray, that's what the level of trust in media was pre-COVID. And in one calendar year, the digital channels just got absolutely taken out by the knees. YouTube lost 50%. Facebook just dropped off the planet. Websites in general, this idea of like lack of trust in the actual site. Instagram took a hit, Twitter took a hit, TikTok we didn't measure, it didn't really exist back then. What did, but it wasn't really measurable. This was totally understandable, right? I mean, first of all, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation, but it's also the beginning of this whole world of sort of AI and genuinely not trusting what you're seeing out there in the world. And I think it's an important thing for us to measure, let's stay on this ride, everyone, because as time goes on, we're for the first time ever, I think we're in this weird environment where the old rule used to be you can have different interpretations of the truth, but the truth remains the same. And we are in a weird world right now where maybe that's not true. Maybe there are not just different versions of the truth, but there genuinely can be different truths because you can make stuff up that looks so damn real that it is a truth. So this whole idea of trust, very important to know where it's going and how fast it's shifting. That was the effect of COVID. Last year, we saw a little bit of a bump for Facebook and YouTube again. So a little bit of faith being restored in those two big guys. Websites kind of held its head. Instagram pretty much stayed where it was. Twitter stayed where it was. So our thought was, well, this will be interesting to watch. I wonder if this is a bit of a bounce back by some of these channels. The explanations for them are potentially varied and numerous. But what was going to happen in 2023? The results this year have absolutely blown me away. I think YouTube, I can only attribute to the likes of Joe Rogans of this world and some of those commentators that have accumulated audiences really, really quickly. We know that we have got all of the podcasting going down and the Spotify going down. It's the only thing I can think of that attributes this sort of a radical shift. Websites remaining pretty flat, but these other digital channels have absolutely bounced back in the last year. And this is in a year, people, where we're leading into the most definitive and important election that we've had in South Africa since 1994. Understanding the power of these channels, I think, is going to make a massive difference, not just to your brands, how you market brands and services going forward, but literally these things can make a difference to the shape of South Africa and our future. I said to you earlier that the traditional media may remain the most trusted. That 38% for YouTube as a news source now means that YouTube is a more trusted source of information than newspapers. Quite radical. It's a bit of a pivotal moment in time. It's the first time we've seen that happen with digital media, and I can only believe the story is going to get more interesting, more complicated, and more difficult to really get down to the nitty-gritties and understand it. And I think it's why we love doing the work we do in BrandMapp, because if you have access to a data source like BrandMapp and you start understanding this particular segment of the market in granular detail, who are they, what do they want, what do they hope, what do they dream, what else are they doing, then you can really start to understand their behavior. So it brings me to just my sort of conclusion point here. I said to you at the beginning of this presentation, I think we're at a time and place where we need to, in order to service brands, clients, products, service providers, if we as media people, as consultants, as media planners, as media agents, if we really want to service clients well, man, you've got to work a lot harder than before. I think there was a time where you could go out there just armed with a simple Swiss Army knife with a couple of nice things to pull out of the housing. Right now, to understand South Africa, man, you need something far more complicated. You need the right tool right now to understand the consumer landscape in South Africa. There's no such thing as one tool. There are many, many tools. I would encourage you all, as we try to make the world a better place, and as we go into what's going to be one of the harder years, I think, of understanding the consumer landscape, use everything at your disposal. Don't be lazy about it and just choose one tool and hit, media plan. And obviously, we'd like to think that BrandMapp is the tool if you want to understand that top end of the triangle. There is so much more in it than I've just shown you. And if you'd like to know more about it, feel free to get hold of us. Obviously, it's available on the Telmar tool, and that's when the data gets really exciting, when you can start cross-tabbing it and cross-referencing all sorts of things for yourself. And with that, I'd like to just say thanks very much, everybody, for joining us again. Hope you found some of that interesting. And if nothing else, hopefully it'll make you even more interesting than you already are at your next dinner party. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, BrandMapp, and thanks for the Telmar team for letting us share all of this with everybody.